Hello everyone, so today we're going to be looking at the interdependence of species. And so the study design dot point says you need to understand the survival through interdependencies between species, including the impact of changes to keystone species and predators, and the ecological roles in structuring and maintaining the distribution, density, and size of a population in an ecosystem. So there is a lot to unpack here, but let's get started. Before we begin, I want you to understand some key terms. So habitat refers to the natural environment of an organism. Biodiversity refers to the variety of life that exists in a particular habitat or in the whole world. And then interdependence refers to how organisms depend on each other for survival. We've looked at levels of organization before earlier this year, and we looked at how cells can group together to form tissues, tissues then group together to form organs, and organs group together to form organ systems, which then forms the whole organism. So we've looked at what's in between these two levels. But on a much larger scale, when we look at ecological organization, we can look at how an organism forms a population, populations form a community, and the community is part of an ecosystem. And I've got some definitions on the next slide. So an individual or an organism is just a single member of a species. A population then is individuals of the same species in the same area at the same time. So that's the important part, same species in same area at the same time. Now all these populations, so multiple populations and different species, living and interacting in the same area form a community. An ecosystem then is that interaction between the community and the non-living or abiotic parts of the environment. So it's the interaction between living and non-living that is the important part of the ecosystem. I'm going to give you a real life example here. You don't need to memorize these specific examples, but this is how you would look at the ecological organization in the Australian ecosystem. So here we have three different populations. We have the speckled flying fox, we have the Bennett's tree kangaroo down here, and we have the Queensland umbrella tree. Together, they form a community. So the speckled flying fox and the Bennett's tree kangaroo feed on the nectar of this Queensland umbrella tree. The ecosystem then is the speckled flying fox, the Bennett's tree kangaroo, and the Queensland umbrella tree being found in the Daintree rainforest among other plants and wildlife, and those interactions with the abiotic parts of that ecosystem. So the wind, the water, the temperature, that kind of thing. It's important to note that ecosystems can be small or large, or they can be simple or complex. So as we see here, we have some fungi growing on a dead tree. This is quite a small ecosystem. Over here, we have a rock pool, still a very small ecosystem, but it's very complex. As you can see, there are many different species of aquatic plants you can just see from this small picture. And then we could also have very large ecosystems like the Victorian mallee, which takes up a large part of Victoria, and these are all eucalyptus trees that form an ecosystem. Let's take a closer look at populations now. So, a reminder, a population is a group of organisms from the same species living in the same geographical region at the same time. When we're describing the structure of a population, we can talk about size, distribution, and density. And so if you think back to the study design dot point, it was talking about how these interdependencies between species can affect these things, such as the size, distribution, and density of a population. So let's look at what these three things are before we figure out how those interdependencies between species can affect them. A population size is just the total number of individuals in the population. This, of course, can be affected by births, deaths, immigration, so organisms moving into the population, or emigration, organisms moving out. Carrying capacity then refers to the maximum population size that an ecosystem can support indefinitely. So this is based on limiting factors such as resources like food, water, shelter, possible mates or amount of offspring, predators, disease, environmental changes. All of this can affect the maximum population that an ecosystem can support. For example, if there are more individuals in the population than resources, obviously that population is going to decrease. So we have a maximum level or maximum size of a population that can be supported by the ecosystem. Often people believe that as the population increases, it will just keep going up and up and up, and the population will continue to increase, but that's not true. Carrying capacity limits the population size. So this is the amount of resources or other environmental factors that limit the population size. So a population can increase till it reaches carrying capacity and then it stops. So if we look at this example, maybe you have a population that moves to a new area over here, and they've got lots of resources here. There's lots of food, water, shelter. So because of all this abundance of resources, this population increases and keeps increasing till it reaches a certain point over here at E, where there are more individuals than the environment can provide for. And so there's not enough food, for example, so some of the population dies and the population goes down. And now we have less individuals and we have more food available. So reproduction increases again, more individuals are able to survive, and we have this, wavering around this carrying capacity. So it can go up and down, but it stays pretty stable around this carrying capacity. Another way we can describe the structure of a population is by looking at the population distribution. So this is the range of geographical areas in which members of a population can be found. So if you can look at this diagram over here, you can see that this red or shaded in area is where all the koalas can be found in Australia. So this is the koalas population distribution. And so this distribution is affected by a few things. So an individual species needs, the location and amount of resources, whether in a climate, habitat loss, disease, and parasites. So from this map, we can see that possibly around this area is where maybe the food that koalas eat is found, or maybe this is the ideal climate for koalas, or maybe this area over here has a lot of habitat loss and therefore koalas are only found in this very small portion of Australia. Could be many reasons that affect this distribution. Here's another map that shows a population distribution, this time for palm trees. As you can see, they're found around this middle section of the world. As you can probably guess, these areas tend to be a little warmer, a little bit more humid, so this is the ideal location for these palm trees. Distribution can be described in 3 different ways. So we can have random distribution, which, as you can tell from the name, it is just random. Uniform distribution, so we have these uniform clusters dispersed evenly or relatively evenly in the environment, or we can have clumped distribution, so all the organisms are clumped into one area. You can think of a few different reasons why this might happen. Maybe for clumped distribution, this is the area which the food can be found for this particular species. Uniform distribution might be because these organisms live in small groups and are very territorial, so they remain in their small area. And then random distribution is of course random, so there might be an availability of resources everywhere in this environment, and therefore the organism can be found everywhere. The third way you can describe a population structure is by describing its density. So this is the number of individuals from a population per unit of area. So for example, you might have 4 koalas per hectare on the New South Wales North Coast. Or you can have 1.2 to 2.1 platypus per kilometre squared in Melbourne. So this is the number of individuals per unit of area, and this part is the unit of area. Biotic and abiotic factors can influence populations' growth, so sometimes dense populations may be influenced by a specific factor more than less dense populations, such as disease can have a bigger impact on more dense populations. However, droughts will affect all populations regardless of density equally. You can see this when we went through the pandemic. Areas where there were more people were more affected by the disease. For example, in the city of Melbourne, there was much more prevalence of COVID than out in the country where there was less people, so less density. However, if, for example, Victoria is going through a drought, that's going to affect everyone regardless of how dense the populations are. So the city of Melbourne will be equally affected as the people in the country, even though there are less people in the country. The drought is going to affect everyone equally, but factors like disease will affect more dense populations. Here is a map that shows density. So this is the amount of pigs per square kilometre. So the darker the red colour, the more pigs per square kilometre. So you can see there is a part of Victoria here and Adelaide where there is a high number of pigs compared to other parts of Australia. To sum it all up, here is an example of the red kangaroo. So we can look at the population size, which is over 11 million in Australia. We've got a map of the population distribution. And then if we look at the density in New South Wales, for example, it would be 4.58 red kangaroos per kilometre squared. Let's have a look at the interactions between species, and so then we can identify how these species are interdependent on each other. We can describe interactions between two species as either being beneficial or advantageous, neutral, or negative and disadvantageous for one or both of the species. So it might be beneficial for one, neutral for the other, or negative for both, for example. These interactions between these two organisms of a different species that live in close proximity of each other is called symbiosis. There are a few different symbiotic or relationships of symbiosis that you will need to know. So mutualism, commensalism, parasitism, and amensalism. As you can see, I've indicated in brackets here how they are either positive and positive for both species, or positive for one species, neutral for the other, positive for one species, negative for the other, and then neutral for one species, negative for the other. There are two more types of ecological relationships that I want you to know. It's important to note that these are not considered symbiosis. However, they are ecological relationships that you need to know. So we've got predation, where one species benefits, one species is harmed, and then we also have competition, where both species are harmed by this interaction. To sum it up, we've got 4 different symbiotic interactions and 2 non-symbiotic interactions, but all of these are considered to be ecological relationships, and you need to know each of them and how the species benefit or don't benefit or are neutral in each of these scenarios. Let's begin with mutualism. So here both species benefit from this interaction, so it's a positive relationship, and these can involve adaptations that help the relationship. I've got some examples here, maybe just remembering one example for each of these. Of course, you don't have to remember any of these examples, you can come up with your own. Here we have coral, and we have an algae called zooxanthellae. And so the algae are able to photosynthesize, and they live in the coral or on the surface of the coral. And through them photosynthesizing, they provide nutrients for the coral, and then the coral provide a home for the algae. So coral benefits by getting the nutrients, the algae benefit by having a protective home. Here we have lichen, which is a fungi and an algae or a cyanobacteria growing together. They benefit from each other by sharing nutrients and providing protection for each other. Next, we have commensalism, where one species benefits and the other species is neutral. So they neither benefit or are disadvantaged by this. And there's no harm done for them. All right, so we have here a shoot growing on a tree. So this shoot is benefiting because they are growing off this tree. They have a space to grow. This tree is not damaged by this at all because this plant is not taking any nutrients from it. Some plants might, but in this case, this plant is not. Here we have this owl. So the owl benefits in that it has a space to live. The tree does not benefit or is not harmed by having this owl live in it. Either way, this interaction doesn't affect the tree, but the owl is benefiting from this interaction. Now we have parasitism, where one species benefits and the other one is harmed. So the parasite relies on the host for food. So the parasite is the species or the organism that benefits, whereas the host is providing the food or the energy, and it is harmed by this interaction. The host is usually harmed but may not be killed. The host can have a shortened lifespan because of the parasite relying on it for food. There can be impaired functions such as digestion or photosynthesis or reproduction, as well as a lowered ability to deal with environmental changes because they are not at full health. So for example, here we have a tapeworm in a digestive tract. This tapeworm is going to take nutrients from the host, so the organism that it's living inside, and the organism loses nutrients, it loses energy. It might also have digestive problems from this tapeworm living inside it. So tapeworm benefits, host is harmed. Over on this side, we have a stinking corpse lily, which sounds exactly the way it is. This is a plant that gets nutrients from their host plant. So you can't quite tell, but it's attached to another plant behind here. And this stinking corpse lily is actually taking the nutrients from that plant it's attached to, as it doesn't photosynthesize itself. So it's relying on the other plant to photosynthesize, and it takes the nutrients from it. Stinking corpse lily then obviously benefits. It's able to grow, it's able to function, whereas the other plant is spending a lot of energy to photosynthesize but is not reaping the benefit, so it's actually harmed. Stinking corpse lily, of course, is a very, very smelly plant, and it smells like a corpse, and hence its name, the stinking corpse lily, which I think is pretty cool. It's quite a huge plant. I find very fascinating. Hope you will too. Many parasites will have multiple hosts across their lifespan, and an organism that transfers a parasite from one host to another is called a vector. And so over here we have a mosquito, and a mosquito is a very common vector. So the mosquito actually transfers this Plasmodium parasite from one animal to another, and this Plasmodium parasite actually causes malaria. So it's not the mosquito that itself that causes malaria, the mosquito is just transferring the parasite that does this. So in this example, the Plasmodium benefits from living inside the host. It has a place to live, it's taking nutrients from the host, and it's benefiting in that way, whereas the host, maybe it's a human, it now has a disease that is causing harm, and they are actually being disadvantaged by this interaction, which has all been enabled by this vector, the mosquito. Next, we have amensalism. And so in this interaction, one species is unaffected or gains no benefit, so it's neutral, and the other one is harmed. And this often happens accidentally. So in this example here, we have the cattle or the cows as one species and the grass as another. The cattle accidentally kill the grass as they walk across it. This doesn't benefit the cows in any way. So they are not benefited at all by killing the grass by accident. But the grass is killed, so they are harmed, very much so in this. And so it's an accidental interaction, I guess, where the cows are neutral, the grass is harmed. Same over here, we have a type of bird that are living in this tree. Well, there's many of those birds in the tree. The birds are defecating on the tree, which is then killing the plant itself. So as you can see, these trees are very barren. They've lost all their leaves. It's because of the birds defecating on the tree. The birds don't get any benefit by defecating and killing this tree. So they're completely neutral in this interaction, but the tree is harmed. It is dying because of this interaction. Now we have predation, and remember, predation is not a symbiotic relationship. However, it is still an ecological relationship that I want you to know. So in this scenario, in this interaction, one species benefits while the other species is harmed. So the predator kills and feeds on the prey. So you can see a very obvious benefiting species and a harmed species. Predators may hunt and kill, or they may trap their prey, as you can see in these two images down the bottom. Many adaptations have evolved as a result of this predator-prey relationship. So for example, a lot of predators will have claws, sharp teeth, they'll be very fast, have a lot of strength, whereas the prey might develop adaptations to evade being caught and eaten, such as camouflage, poisons or toxins, speed as well, warning signals, highly developed senses. All of these things are adaptations that help either the prey or the predator. So obvious examples here, we have a cheetah hunting, I think this is a gazelle. Gazelle obviously is harmed, cheetah benefits because it gets food. Here we have a spider and some sort of insect. Again, spider benefits as it gets food, the insect is harmed because it is killed. Here I have a graph that shows the population size of the hare, which is a type of rabbit, and a lynx, which is a type of large cat, wild cat. And so the blue line is the hare population, as you can see, going up and down and so on. And then you've got the lynx population. As you can see, there are similar rises and falls for this hare and lynx population. So the hare is eaten by the lynx. So the lynx is the predator and the hare is the prey. As you can see right at the start here, as the predator population dies down, the prey population increases because there are less lynx eating the hares. So obviously there's more hares to reproduce and their population increases. But as you can see, once the lynx population increases, maybe because there's more hares to eat, there's more resources in the ecosystem, that lynx population increases, and then you can see the hare population decrease because the lynx are eating more of the hares, and so on. And you can see this cycle continue, and this predator-prey relationship and how it affects the population size. The last ecological relationship we're going to look at, and again this is a non-symbiotic relationship, is competition. And so this is when both species are disadvantaged by this relationship. Often this can occur when the two species need the same limited resources. So they're competing for the resources, whether that be food, water, space, nest sites, mates, whatever it is. Each species then has to spend more energy to get those limited resources, and the spending of more energy to get these limited resources is how each species is disadvantaged by this interaction. And this also may lead to reduced ability to survive. So if, for example, in this scenario over here, we have all these different fish species, they are competing for the same food and the same space. If there's a limited resource in terms of food, there is probably not enough food to enable the survival of every single individual. So some of the species, or well, both of the species, are disadvantaged by this interaction. Over on this side, we have these three trees. As you can see, there's one really large tree and two smaller trees. They're all competing for the same resources in that they're competing for space, so the roots underneath the soil, the water, sunlight, which can then limit the growth of all three because they're not getting the amount of resources that they need because they are in direct competition with each other. So competition can also be described as interspecific, so between different species. As we can see over here, we've got, I believe, a chipmunk. I'm not too sure. I think it's a chipmunk competing with some birds over some food. So that's between different species. Or you can have intra-specific competition. That's between the same species. So here we have two animals. They're called dholes. They're like kind of like dogs, and they are fighting over this food. And now intraspecific competition is density dependent. So if there is a increased density or a large density, there is going to be more intraspecific competition because there are more individuals from that population competing for the same resources. Lastly, let's look at some keystone species. So what is a keystone species? Well, it is a species that has a disproportionately large impact on an ecosystem relative to the size of its population. So it is a specific species that has a very large impact, even if that population size might be smaller than other populations. Without these species, the ecosystem would be extremely different, or it would not exist. There are three common roles of keystone species that I want you to know. So we have apex predators, ecosystem engineers, and mutualists. So just some background on what we mean by keystone. So historically, this stone in an archway is called a keystone because this stone here is holding everything else up. If you remove this specific stone, this whole arch would fall. So in that sense, a keystone species is a species that is holding the whole ecosystem together. Over here we have a quick example of a keystone species, which is a shark. So they are apex predators. If you remove the shark from the ecosystem, you can see the biodiversity actually decreases. Let's look at apex predators. So this is our first keystone species. So it's a predator that is at the very top of the food chain or the food web. And there are no other organisms above them, and therefore nothing is eating them. This apex predator has no predators. And they control the population size of all the prey underneath them. So because this shark at the top is eating these smaller sharks, these sharks aren't overpopulated, and therefore they're not eating all the tuna and the lancet fish here and the squid and mackerel and so on. So it is controlling the population size. For example, if we removed this large shark, this smaller shark and this marine their populations would increase a lot. So we'd have more of these two species. And because there are more of these two species, they're going to eat more tuna, lancet fish, squid, and mackerel. And so on this level, their populations are going to decrease. And if these populations decrease, then there's nothing eating the lanternfish or the amphipods or the ocean sunfish and the zooplankton down here. And these populations will then increase a lot. And so, as you can see, just by removing this top predator, this apex predator, it affects all these populations. So the job of this apex predator is to control the population size of all the prey that are underneath it on the food chain. So as you can see here, this is just another example. We have a bear at the top. So this is the apex predator. It eats the squirrel, the moose, and the fish. If this apex predator was removed from this ecosystem, these three populations would increase in size and therefore decrease the populations of the organisms that it eats. And so we're changing the population if this apex predator is removed. So the apex predator, again, this bear, is controlling the population size of everything underneath it. The second keystone species I want you to know is an ecosystem engineer. And so an ecosystem engineer interacts with and significantly alters the environment that they live in by creating new habitats for other members of the ecosystem to live in. So it is an engineer, so it's creating the ecosystem, so it's creating habitats. A very common example are beavers. They create these massive dams. And they're very important for the ecosystem in a lot of rivers, in that they give fish, amphibians, insects, water birds, marsh plant, and so many more organisms a home in these beaver pools, or these beaver pools over here, or the dams. It helps filter the water actually, so all the water that runs through the dams is filtered as it comes out this end. And it also helps prevent flooding. So these beavers create this ecosystem, or they create this habitat that benefits the ecosystem as a whole. Here is just a closer look at some of these beaver dams. As you can see, the beavers live in these dams, and it provides a habitat for many other species and benefits the ecosystem. Lastly, we have mutualists. So if we think back to before, we were looking at mutualism. So this is when both species benefit from this interaction. So mutualists have a relationship that profoundly affects the ecosystem. Here is an example. So for a period of year, we have these banksia plants that flower, and they are a source of food for this honey eater. If these banksia flowers were lost, it would also affect the honey eater and the rest of the ecosystem. So through this interaction, they are benefiting from each other, but they're also affecting the whole ecosystem because there are other animals that rely on the honey eater and this banksia plant. And this is where I leave you with this meme. This was a very long video, so hopefully you took your time as you went through it. As usual, write down your questions and I will see you in class.